In 1891, in the remote hills of Brete County, Kentucky, a woman named Margaret Aldridge hanged herself from the rafters of a cabin she could not escape. She was 38 years old. Her death ended 14 years of captivity orchestrated by her own nephews Luther and Silas Trent, who had forced her into marriage with Luther when she was just 24, claiming divine authority and family duty. When a traveling Methodist circuit writer discovered Margaret's suicide note hidden in her Bible, detailing years of forced matrimony, psychological torture, and imprisonment, the investigation revealed a nightmare of religious delusion and familial control that had flourished in silence. How does blood kinship transform from protection into prison? And what darkness thrives when family becomes jailer? Subscribe to stand with us in exposing these buried truths and comment your city so we know where these stories reach. Margaret's note written in fading ink on torn pages would become the most damning evidence in a case that shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. The eastern mountains of Brete County existed in a world apart from the rest of Kentucky. In the 1880s, dense forests of oak, hickory, and mountain laurel covered ridges so steep that wagon roads were impossible, and settlements clung to narrow creek valleys where sunlight reached the ground only at midday. The Civil War had devastated the region to decades prior, leaving communities fractured and suspicious, with feuds between families replacing any meaningful law enforcement. The county seat at Jackson lay 15 miles from the Trent property, but those 15 miles meant 2 days of hard travel over treacherous mountain trails that became impassable in winter. No telegraph lines reached these hollows. The nearest railroad depot was 40 miles away in Hazard Perry County. People lived by subsistence, farming, moonshining, and timbering, their lives governed by kinship networks and religious conviction rather than courts or constables. The sheriff's jurisdiction was theoretical at best. One man could not patrol hundreds of square miles of wilderness, and mountain families settled their own affairs with their own justice. In this isolation, a woman could vanish into a cabin and simply cease to exist in any meaningful way, absorbed into a family structure that recognized no outside authority. Neighbors lived a mile or more apart, separated by ridgeal lines and hollers, seeing each other only at monthly church gatherings or chance encounters. Men disappeared regularly in these mountains, lost to mining accidents, feuds, or simply the decision to start fresh elsewhere, and no one thought to question it deeply. The mountains kept their secrets with patient indifference, and the Trent family hollow, tucked 3 miles up Troublesome Creek from the nearest neighbor, was more isolated than most. Margaret Aldridge had come to the Trent property in 1877 as a 24-year-old widow, her husband having died of typhoid fever after only 2 years of marriage. She was the younger sister of Sarah Trent, who had married Jacob Trent and died in childbirth in 1875, leaving 2 sons, Luther, then 15, and Silas, 13. Jacob Trent himself had died 6 months later from injuries sustained in a logging accident, leaving the boys orphaned and in possession of a 40-acre timber claim and a sturdy cabin. Margaret arrived with the intention of managing the household temporarily, helping her nephews until they could marry and establish their own families. She was described by those who knew her then as quiet but capable, with dark hair she wore in a tight bun and a practical manner suited to mountain life. A traveling peddler named Josiah Riss, who sold dry goods and notions throughout the county, encountered the family in 1878 and later recalled his unease. Luther Trent, by then 16, stood well over 6 trillion tall with a lean, ropey build and pale gray eyes that seemed to track movement with unsettling precision. He spoke little, answering questions with single words or nods, but his presence dominated the small cabin. Silas was shorter, broader with his mother's dark coloring, but shared his brother's silent intensity. Rix observed that Margaret seemed nervous in their presence, deferring to Luther on even trivial matters and keeping her gaze lowered. When Rix mentioned this, 2 others, it was dismissed. Mountain boys matured early into patriarchs, and a woman living with young men naturally showed respect. What struck Rix more was the purchase Margaret made: 20 feet of heavy chain and 3 iron padlocks, items she claimed were necessary for securing the smokehouse against bears that had been raiding their stores. She paid in silver coins, unusual for people who typically bartered goods and labor. The cabin's windows were shuttered more often than not, even in warm weather, and no one was invited past the threshold. The first man to disappear in connection with the trench was actually Margaret herself, though it took years for anyone to realize it. In 1879, a neighbor woman named Ida Combs asked about Margaret at a church meeting. Noting she had not seen her in months, Luther explained that his aunt had married him that spring, a union he claimed she had desired for stability and to keep the family property intact. Mountain marriages were often arranged for practical reasons, and while marrying one's nephew was unusual, it was not unheard of in isolated communities where options were limited and kinship lines became tangled. Luther produced a marriage certificate signed by a traveling preacher he claimed had passed through, though no one could recall such a preacher or verify his credentials. Margaret did not attend church afterward, which Luther explained as a consequence of her frail health and difficulty with the difficult walk to the meeting house. Over the following years, Margaret was occasionally glimpsed working in the garden or hanging laundry, always at a distance, always silent. When Ida Combs managed to approach the property in 1881 to deliver a quilt, Luther intercepted her at the property line, explaining that Margaret was ill with consumption and could not receive visitors. Margaret herself appeared briefly at a window, pale and thin, raising her hand in what might have been greeting or warning before the shutters closed. By 1883, even these glimpses ceased. The community accepted Luther's explanation that Margaret had become bedridden, and mountain propriety discouraged uninvited visits to a home where a woman was indisposed. In 1885, a second disappearance occurred, though this one involved a man, Thomas Whitaker, a 32-year-old timber buyer from Jackson, traveled to the Trent property to assess their lumber holdings and negotiate a contract. He never returned to Jackson. His horse was found 3 days later wandering near Troublesome Creek with its saddle still secured. Luther claimed Whitaker had completed his business and departed, and suggested he might have been thrown from his horse crossing the creek during high water. Whitaker's body was never recovered. Mountain streams could carry a corpse miles downstream or wedge it beneath log jams where it would never be found. The disappearance was ruled a probable accident. The man who refused to accept convenient explanations was Deputy Marshal James Colton Marsh, 41 years old, a Union Army veteran who had served with the 14th Kentucky Infantry and returned to Breed County. With a methodical mind and a distrust of easy answers, Marsh had grown up in these mountains and understood their ways, but he also possessed a formal education rare for the region. 3 years at a seminary before the war, and he maintained meticulous records of every complaint, incident, and unexplained event in his jurisdiction. In 1886, Marsh began reviewing cases of missing persons and noticed a disturbing pattern. Over 8 years, 4 men had disappeared after visiting or being seen near the Trent property. Besides Whitaker, there was Elijah Sizemore, a land surveyor who vanished in 1884, Amos Craft, a moonshine buyer who failed to return from a purchasing trip in 1883, and most recently, Reverend Caleb Morrison, a Methodist circuit rider who disappeared in early 1886 after announcing his intention to visit the Trents to check on Margaret's spiritual welfare. All were experienced men familiar with mountain travel. All had horses that were either found wandering or never recovered. The statistical improbability troubled Marsh. He mapped the disappearances and found they clustered within a 3-mile radius of the Trent cabin. He interviewed family members of the missing men, documenting their concerns and establishing that none had reasons to abandon their lives. Deliberately, Marsh's methodology was simple but effective. He treated each disappearance as potentially criminal rather than accidental, gathering evidence as if for eventual prosecution. He documented the Trents' increasing prosperity despite producing little visible income, noting they purchased supplies with cash rather than credit, unusual for subsistence farmers. Most troubling was the complete absence of Margaret Aldridge from community life after 1883. Marsh had known Margaret before her widowhood. They had attended the same church, and her transformation from an independent woman to an invisible presence disturbed him deeply. His conviction that something evil transpired in that hollow grew with each file he reviewed. But conviction was not evidence. In October of 1888, Marsh rode to the Trent property for the first time, a journey that required leaving Jackson before dawn and climbing narrow trails, where his horse's hooves dislodged stones that clattered into unseen ravines below. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering hemlocks that blocked much of the daylight, giving the property a perpetual twilight gloom. The structure was well maintained with a stone chimney and a new roof, suggesting resources beyond typical mountain poverty. Luther Trent emerged before Marsh could dismount, his now imposing frame blocking the doorway. He was 28 years old, his face weathered beyond his years, his pale eyes assessing Marsh with undisguised hostility. Silas appeared moments later, positioning himself to Marsh's left, creating a subtle flanking position. Marsh explained he was investigating the disappearance of Reverend Morrison and wished to ask routine questions. Luther's response was measured and legally informed. He stated that Morrison had visited briefly in February, discussed scripture, and departed before nightfall. When Marsh asked to speak with Margaret, Luther explained she was too ill for visitors and suggested that forcing himself upon a sick woman would be ungentlemanly. The word choice was deliberate, implying Marsh's inquiry was improper rather than official. When Marsh asked about the other missing men, Luther calmly explained each disappearance with plausible theories. Whitaker drowned. Sizemore probably fell into an abandoned mineshaft. Kraft likely ran afoul of competing moonshiners who operated violently in these hills. His explanations were detailed enough to seem credible, but vague enough to prevent verification. Marsh observed during this exchange that the cabin windows were not just shuttered, but appeared to be nailed closed from the inside. He noticed fresh lumber stacked near a shed, quality wood that should have generated visible income if sold. Most significantly, he saw no evidence of Margaret's presence. No laundry suggesting a woman's touch, no garden vegetables being harvested, nothing to indicate a living woman inhabited the property. Luther permitted no entry to the cabin, and Marsh lacked legal authority to force the issue without evidence of a crime. He departed with the sinking certainty that Margaret Aldridge was either imprisoned or dead, but with nothing concrete to justify further action. 4 years passed. By 1891, Marsh's unofficial investigation had stalled completely. The missing persons cases remained open, but inactive, filed away with dozens of other unsolved matters. Luther and Silas Trent continued their isolated existence, occasionally appearing in Jackson to purchase supplies, conducting themselves with cold propriety that discouraged questions. Then on September 7, 1891, everything changed. A traveling physician named Dr. Edward Ashford was passing through Brete County offering medical services to remote families for modest fees. He approached the Trent property on a Tuesday afternoon, having heard rumors of a chronically ill woman who might need care. What happened next was documented in Ashford's subsequent sworn testimony. Luther Trent met him at the property boundary and refused medical services, but Ashford, perhaps more persistent than previous visitors, insisted that abandoning a sick woman was both cruel and potentially criminal if disease spread to the community. The confrontation escalated. Silas emerged from the cabin with a rifle and Ashford, sensing genuine danger, retreated but did not leave the area. He circled to higher ground overlooking the property and maintained surveillance from the tree line, a decision that would prove crucial. At approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, he witnessed through field glasses a woman emerge from the cabin, the first confirmed sighting of Margaret in 8 years. She moved to a large oak tree near the cabin, carrying what appeared to be a length of rope. Ashford watched in horror as Margaret fashioned a noose, secured it to a high branch, and hanged herself. She died within minutes. Ashford immediately rode for Jackson, reaching Deputy Marshal Marsh that evening with his account. Marsh assembled a posy of 6 men and departed at dawn. The raid on the Trent property commenced on September 8th at sunrise. Marsh brought 3 deputies and 3 civilian volunteers, all armed. Anticipating resistance, they found Luther and Silas standing outside the cabin, waiting with unsettling calm, as if they had expected this rival. Margaret's body still hung from the oak tree, undisturbed through the night, a sight that hardened even these frontier lawmen who had seen death in many forms. When Marsh announced his intention to investigate Margaret's death and search the property, Luther did not resist, but instead made a statement that chilled the assembled men. "She was my wife, and she was weak. God will judge her for the sin of self-murder, and he will judge you for your interference." Silas said nothing, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. The brothers were placed in restraints without resistance, though both were armed and could have fought. The first discovery came within 20 minutes of entering the cabin. Margaret's living space was a small bedroom with a heavy door that locked from the outside. With a sliding bolt, the room measured approximately 8 feet by 10 feet with a single narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a small table. The window was not just shuttered, but boarded over from the outside with heavy planks nailed into the frame. On the table lay a Bible, and tucked within its pages was Margaret's suicide note. Written over many pages in increasingly desperate handwriting, in it, she detailed her captivity. How Luther had announced in 1879 that God had commanded their marriage to preserve the family line. How she had refused and been locked in this room. How Silas had assisted in guarding her, and had himself later announced he would marry her. When Luther, tired of her as Old Testament patriarchs had multiple wives, the note described years of forced cohabitation, psychological torture disguised as religious instruction, and isolation so complete that she had not spoken to another human being except her captors in over a decade. She wrote of hearing visitors turned away, of scratching at walls hoping someone would hear, of her gradual descent into despair. The final entry, dated September 7th, read simply, "I can bear no more. I choose the only freedom left to me. God forgive my weakness." The search intensified as Marcia's men processed the full horror of Margaret's imprisonment. In a locked trunk beneath Luther's bed, they discovered a collection that documented obsession and calculation. There were 15 leather-bound journals spanning 14 years, meticulous records of Margaret's captivity written in Luther's precise hand. The entries detailed his theological justifications for forced marriage, citing Deuteronomy and Leviticus passages about levirate marriage and family obligation, grotesquely misapplied to justify incest and captivity. He had convinced himself that preserving the Trent bloodline was a divine mandate, that Margaret's initial resistance was sinful pride that required breaking, and that her eventual compliance, born of exhaustion and terror, was evidence of God's approval. The journals recorded her menstrual cycles, her physical condition, and his frustration that she had not conceived children, which he interpreted as divine displeasure requiring harsher discipline. Silas's role was documented as enforcer and believer. Luther had indoctrinated his younger brother completely, convincing him that their actions were righteous and that outside interference represented satanic opposition to God's plan. The trunk also contained personal effects from the four missing men: Whitaker's pocket watch engraved with his initials, Reverend Morrison's small leather Bible with his name inscribed on the fly leaf, a surveyor's compass belonging to Sizemore, and Kraft's distinctive silver flask. These items proved the men had not simply disappeared. They had died on this property. When confronted, Luther showed no remorse. He stated calmly that each man had discovered Margaret's imprisonment through accident or persistence, and each had threatened to report him to authorities. He had killed them in what he described as righteous self-defense, protecting his God-ordained marriage from interference. He had shot Whitaker when the timber buyer heard Margaret crying out. He had poisoned Morrison's coffee when the Reverend insisted on seeing Margaret. To offer spiritual comfort, Sizemore had fallen victim to a blow to the head when he saw Margaret through a gap in the shutters. Kraft had been strangled when he drunkenly stumbled upon Margaret, attempting to escape one night. Luther had disposed of the bodies by burning them in a kiln he had built specifically for lumber drying, then scattering the ashes and remaining bone fragments in the forest. Silas had assisted with all for murders and the subsequent disposal of remains. The brothers were transported to Jackson and held in the county jail pending trial. Margaret's body was examined by the county coroner, who documented evidence of long-term malnutrition, muscle atrophy consistent with limited movement, and scarring around her wrists and ankles, suggesting she had been restrained with chains or rope at various times. Her physical condition indicated years of deprivation and abuse. The trial of Luther and Silas Trent commenced on November 3, 1891 in the Brete County Circuit Court. The proceedings lasted 6 days. Dr. Ashford testified about witnessing Margaret's suicide. Deputy Marshal Marsh presented the evidence recovered from the property, including Margaret's note and Luther's journals. Character witnesses from Jackson testified about the missing men, establishing their responsible natures and the unlikelihood of voluntary disappearance. The defense, such as it was, rested on Luther's claim that his marriage to Margaret was legal, though no legitimate marriage record could be produced, and that his actions with the missing men constituted defense of his home and family. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On November 9th, both brothers were convicted for counts of murder in the first degree. Kentucky law prescribed death by hanging for such convictions. The judge, a stern Methodist named Harrison Blackwell, pronounced sentence with visible anger, stating that the defendants had perverted Scripture and family bonds into instruments of tyranny and murder, and that their crimes represented evil in its purest form. Luther and Silas Trent were hanged on January 14, 1892. In the yard of the Brete County Courthouse, Luther's final words were a prayer claiming his innocence before God. Silas remained silent. Both died within minutes as several hundred citizens watched, an unusually large crowd drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Margaret Aldridge was buried in the cemetery at the Methodist Church, where she had worshipped before her captivity. Her grave marked with a simple stone that identified her as sister, aunt, and victim. The community contributed funds to ensure a proper burial, an acknowledgement of their collective failure to rescue her from captivity that had occurred. Within miles of their homes, the Trent property was burned to the ground by citizens 3 days after the execution, a deliberate erasure intended to cleanse the hollow of its evil associations. No structure was ever rebuilt on the site. The land eventually reverted to the state for unpaid taxes and remains unoccupied to this day, overgrown with forest and avoided by hunters who report an oppressive atmosphere. In that particular hollow, the case prompted Brete County to establish more rigorous protocols for investigating missing persons and welfare checks on isolated households, reforms that Deputy Marshal Marsh championed. Until his retirement in 191, the Kentucky legislature used the Trent case as precedent when debating laws about domestic violence and women's rights. Though meaningful legal protections for women remained decades away, local folklore transformed the property into a cautionary site. Parents warned children against wandering near Troublesome Creek, and stories circulated about ghostly cries heard in the hollow on autumn nights. Whether these accounts reflected genuine phenomena or collective guilt manifesting as supernatural belief is unknowable, but the Trent Hollow acquired a reputation that persists in local memory. Even now, more than a century later, Margaret's story became a dark parable about the cost of isolation, the danger of unchecked patriarchal authority disguised as religious conviction, and the silent suffering that can occur when communities fail to question what happens behind closed doors. The most haunting aspect of the case remains the time frame, 14 years during which Margaret existed only yards from potential rescue, her voice literally within earshot of visitors who were turned away, her captivity sustained by a conspiracy of indifference and the assumption that family matters were private matters beyond the reach of law or conscience. Her final act of hanging herself in view of Dr. Ashford, whether intentional or coincidental, became the only way she could make her suffering visible and undeniable. The cost of looking away can be measured in lives lost and innocence destroyed in dark hollows where law and conscience failed to reach, where blood became chains and family became prison, and where one woman's desperate choice of death over captivity finally forced a community to see what they had chosen not to know.